Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's session, Vulnerable KVMs Give Attackers Remote Access. This is new threat research from Eclipsium's research team. My name is Melissa Russell, and I'll be your host for today. Before we get started, I just wanted to go over a few housekeeping items. The first one is that we are recording today's session, and we will make a link to the recording as well as a link to the slides available probably in the next couple of days. Um, if you have any questions during the session, please go ahead and throw them into that Q&A chat. We will take questions during the session if they make sense, and otherwise we will save a little bit of time towards the end to answer some questions. If we don't get to your questions, we will follow up afterwards. I also wanted to mention that we are offering a certificate of attendance for CPE credits if you want to submit it to whatever CPE body. We are not affiliated with them, but I'm happy to provide a certificate. All you need to do is reply back either to your invite email or to your follow-up email, and I'll make sure to get that out to you. At this time, I'd like to go ahead and introduce our speakers, and I'm going to hand it over to you, Chase.
Right on. Thanks, Melissa. Thanks, everybody, for being here. Good morning, good afternoon, whatever time it is for you. Really pumped to be here to present some new research from Eclipsium. And I'm mostly going to just sort of moderate this conversation between the actual researchers that discovered new vulnerabilities in keyboard, video, mouse devices that are introducing risk into everything from home labs to data centers. So I have with me Paul Asadorian and Reynaldo Vasquez Garcia, aka Ray. Paul, you want to introduce yourself, give a little background on yourself, and then we'll have Ray do that, and then we'll dive into the content.
Sure. So I'm Paul Sidorian. I'm a principal security researcher here at Eclipsium. I wear a lot of different hats, including finding and helping coordinate disclosures for vulnerabilities. I also work with our product teams currently to maintain labs and do all kinds of product testing. I also maintain the monitoring of the threat landscape and feed that back into various teams here at Eclipsium. I also do the Paul Security Weekly podcast as well as the Below the Surface podcast pretty much each and every week. We try and do both of them. So thanks,
Right
Chase.
on. Ray, you want to give a little background on yourself?
Yeah, I'm Ray. I'm a security research intern here at Eclipsium. Right now, I'm just working here in Portland with our Oregon-based research teams, and that's been pretty fun.
Right on. Ray is being very modest. Accomplished security researcher. Gave a DEF CON talk about hacking the vape detector snitch
Right.
puck at the high school a couple years ago and has just been crushing on security research ever since. So, yeah, Paul and Ray both did a bunch of research recently and discovered new vulnerabilities in keyboard, video, mouse devices. And so we're gonna talk about what those are, what the vulnerabilities were. We'll talk about the specific vulns, but also the general market for KVMs and the implications of security vulnerabilities in this type of device if you introduce them into really any systems that are critical for your technology stack. We'll do Q&A throughout. So to everybody in the audience, if you have a comment or a question or some sort of direction that you want to guide the conversation, we love to keep this interactive. We'll read the questions and comments out loud and answer them or debate them or just talk about them as we go. And we'll take a couple of breaks in the middle to catch up with questions that we haven't answered yet if questions come up that don't quite fit into the current slide. So yeah, with that, let's get into it. We'll start out, I think, with just defining what a KVM is. Paul, you wanna take a swat at that? What is a KVM in the keyboard, video, mouse sense?
Yes. So it's interesting. Well, we'll talk about the evolution of it, but for this research, Ray and I focused on IP-based KVMs, which essentially over the network give you the interaction with the keyboard, video, and mouse. So you connect to one of these small little devices that are on the network and also connected to whatever computer or server that you have. And there's a few different ways that it can connect. The easiest way is just to plug in the HDMI and the USB. So that gives you remote keyboard, video, and mouse capabilities. They also have models that can interface with the motherboard directly. So you can, through the KVM, power on, power off, and or reset, the PC through the pins on the actual motherboard. So There's a lot of different makes and models. Many of them are very new to the market. And the new ones to the market are kind of, a lot of them are inexpensive, right? Like typically these were more expensive devices. There's enterprise level devices that do this as well. But many of them are, the newer ones are very low cost, comparatively speaking, to some of the things that have been out there for a while. Oh, I see you have some of the names out there. Raritan, Avocent, are some of the enterprise names, right? So we're now looking at things like Jet KVM, Pi KVM. We looked at Nano KVM, and these are, the smaller, inexpensive devices. But again, they accomplish basically the same thing if we're talking about IP KVMs. They are connected to the network, and providing you with remote access in your browser, typically using something like WebRTC, which is a technology that Ray can probably explain a little more about. But that's the web technology they use to allow you to interface with it. So, Ray, anything to add there?
Um, these the KVMs are definitely like special in the way that they are so how do I explain this? They they're definitely, I think you're right. They're cheaper and they're definitely, they look more lucrative to a, I guess, a company that's trying to you know, be more inexpensive in, what they're, in the hardware they're, buying, right, to manage stuff.
Yeah,
Was part of the motive for deciding to hack on these things in the first place was sort of that they're cheap and they do something
Hmm.
that businesses want to do. And so, but because they're cheap, they probably don't have as strong of security properties built into them. I don't know. How did you decide to hack on these specific types of devices and do this vulnerability analysis that resulted in this research?
Yeah, it was a lot of just going through Amazon. Amazon, you know, a lot of these you can just buy and they're super cheap and the reviews look good, right? But the actual security, right? They're not rating the security when it comes to, I'm assuming that most of the customers were not rating, you know, the security on these KVMs. So we took a look at that. The threat model of that.
yeah, and we'll sometimes use the term KVM. We're referring to IP-based KVMs, right? Historically, KVMs were physical devices that did not connect to the network, that you would connect to multiple computers and then connect one monitor, mouse, and keyboard, like in your data center, and then you could switch between them. So, like if you had a rack of servers, for example, you'd connect all of their KVM, keyboard, video, mouse peripherals to the back of the KVM. Then you'd have one monitor, mouse, and keyboard in the data center, and you could switch between them and interact with them. Now, the models that came out enable you to do that over the network, which, as we'll talk about, can potentially put an attacker in front of your computer as if they're sitting in front of it physically.
Risky business. Yeah, we talked about the general popularity of these devices. They're making their way into the DIY ecosystem. There's tons of videos on YouTube with hundreds of thousands of views about them. So like people are experimenting with these. This Jet KVM one in this video is one of the ones that you guys found vulnerabilities in. Here's Ray and Paul talking about this on our very own podcast. Got a couple thousand views. They're sort of expanding the accessibility of this type of device, right? It used to be the kind of thing where it's like, okay, if you're managing a data center, you spend some company budget on this kind of thing. Now there's zillions of SKUs of these. As Ray pointed out on Amazon, they're cheap. They're just sort of a consonant salad of brand names. They have a bunch of maybe fake Amazon reviews. It's really
Mm.
it's the Wild West of risky devices to give root access to your computers. Um, so yeah, okay, what can an attacker do with a compromised KVM? Like if put yourself in the brain of an adversary, what are you going to do first before we talk about the actual vulnerabilities you discovered and which of these they enable?
Yeah, I describe this as at a high level, Like it's almost like you're taking your keyboard video and mouse devices and just leaving them on an open, busy street for anyone to just walk up and interact with your computer. So once you plug one of these into the network, if an attacker were to compromise it, they have essentially the equivalent of physical access to the device. That includes access to your BIOS or UEFI. So when we talk about undermining that hardware trust, if an attacker were to take over your KVM device, they could reboot it, they could interact with it, get into your BIOS, disable things like secure boot, and do anything you could do in your BIOS, provided you hadn't put a password on your BIOS, as an example. Um, Also, it's a great place for an attacker to hide, similar to Mickey and Jesse's bad cam research, right? When you're an attacker and you can persist on a device that is connected to the computer and or potential target, that means anything can happen on that target. But if the attacker is in the device connected to it, I can constantly reinfect potentially that computer that it's connected to. Can also do things like record screen keystrokes, view the content. And this wouldn't be doing that with like malware I put on the target PC. This would be doing it from the KVM device. So it's very hard to detect. Potentially, depending on configuration and settings, and an attacker can basically gain access to the computer without any authentication. So I actually just tested this the other day when we were talking about this. I have a Windows computer and a Jet KVM connected to it. So if I log into my Windows computer and I leave it logged in, and I've done all the authentication stuff, maybe I've got multi-factor, maybe I've got facial recognition, doesn't matter, I'm logged in. Anyone who connects to that KVM after I've successfully logged in, provided it hasn't timed out yet, is just like they're sitting in front of the computer and they've already logged in. So when you connect over the KVM, it connects you directly to that monitor, mouse, and keyboard. And if the user's logged in, so is the attacker. There's also some persistent stuff that you can do and persist through, OS reinstalls. So if you use the KVM to like infect the computer, because the one of the ways we realized that these KVMs are able to, when you type on your keyboard into your console in the browser, those keystrokes have to go from that device over USB into the computer and look like keystrokes. So it has to look like a hid device. They're actually using Linux USB gadgets, which is the foundation for bad USB attacks, to inject those keystrokes. So the same technology that enables a rubber ducky or any of the, 25 plus different devices you could get to become a bad USB device, that basically same driver or technology is on these KVMs. So as an attacker, I'm able to inject keystrokes. So I could easily just reinfect the machine just by injecting keystrokes.
What do they call that? It's like dual use or something. It's like, oh, nuclear energy is so good, but you literally cannot do the work you need for nuclear energy without making stuff that could also be used to make bombs. It's like
Correct. Yes.
remote access. There's this constant push and pull where you have these data centers, you have these IT environments that you want to lock down as much as possible, but then you're like, but the only expert that knows how to run this thing lives in a different time zone. We want to give them remote access, and you poke a hole in the security, and then that the hole you poked in the
Right.
security is a juicy target for attackers. And if you don't secure that effectively, the idea of leaving a computer, of a keyboard and a monitor outside your house so that anybody can control your computer sounds like a great digital age performance art piece.
Mhm.
But I don't have to think too hard to know where it would end up. Uh, but yeah, okay, so many reasons to be extremely cautious about using KVMs in general, let alone the cheapest KVMs available on Amazon.com. Um, so let's start talking about the actual vulnerabilities. You guys found 9 new vulnerabilities across 4 different KVM vendors, and you went through the proper sort of disclosure processes, right? You reached out to the vendor, told them about it, gave them a chance to fix it or start planning a fix. Notably, most of them either shipped a fix pretty quickly. Shout out Jet KVM, right, for doing the fixes really fast. Uh,
Yeah, Jet KVM was great in that process. Ray found most of them though, so I'll let Ray talk about what
yeah,
was
yeah.
discovered.
Yeah, let's talk about the vulns, right? We'll have like just general summary of what you found, then we'll get into each of the different vendors a little bit more specifically. I just have the Anjit ones here highlighted because that's the highest risk score and also the least close to any sort of a fix happening. So maybe don't buy those until that's fixed.
Yeah. We, a lot of these were uh, we found on Amazon. A lot of Amazon stuff, you can just buy them. GLINet, they also make routers and stuff like that. So, they have a kind of a reputation, but with Angie, it was a lot of, like it was a generic brand name company, and they if you go to their page on Amazon, it's like a bunch of it's literally like copy and paste KVMs, like exact
Yeah.
same cloned KVMs, and a lot of them don't have reviews, but that doesn't mean that no one's buying them, right? And um, it's it's definitely we had reached out to them, and it's kind of funny. We reached out to them, and we hadn't heard back for a week, and then I followed up with a email, and they followed up like the next day, like we don't know what to do. So that was really like concerning, like
Yeah.
wow, these
Red
companies,
flag.
these companies aren't, these companies are just pumping out SKUs and they don't know actually how to like, fix these vulnerabilities.
Yeah, my theory on that, and again, this is just a hypothesis, right, is that it's probably made in a similar factory where like the more expensive GLINet or other, more
Hmm.
reputable brands are made, and they have the hardware and they have the firmware, so they can do like a second or third shift, what I call kind of run, and just produce a whole bunch of them, just slap some firmware on it, go to an Amazon. So, and actually and I don't know if this is true, they just create a fake company, a air quotes fake company, and they just choose
Hmm.
like random English letters and words, which is why you see that in a lot of the Chinese manufactured stuff, like NG. I don't know what that is. It's just like a made up word. They'll brand that
Right.
as the company. They'll sell these things that don't go through as much QA. Like, right? That's why you can go to like Alibaba, AliExpress and buy stuff cheap because some of it is like second run, hasn't gone on through the QA tests. I think they just put one firmware on there. Like Ray and I couldn't figure out how you actually get a firmware upgrade for those
Right.
Anjeet ones, and that's how they're able to sell those on Amazon, for cheap. So that's my theory.
Yeah,
Yeah.
for sure.
It's a sharp contrast to Jet KVM. That was the one that I decided to look into, which in terms of effort and difficulty, I chose poorly because Jet KVM actually had some pretty good security around their web application. But the difference was with Jet KVM. So we ended up creating a Vince case with US CERT, and US CERT was amazing through the process and helped us do the coordination with all of these vendors. So after we did the initial reach out, we went to US CERT. Then they did additional reach out and tried to make sure that everyone was communicating effectively and that everyone was working on fixing these vulnerabilities. And the one of the co-founders of Jet KVM popped in, said, "Yep, I recognize these. I got a fixes out, and addressed all of the vulnerabilities, in which was amazing, right? I mean, they
Yeah.
even implemented that in the rate limiting when you're trying to brute force the password, as an example. So they actually have a rate limiting, which makes brute force guessing that initial password or the password for your Jet KVM device very difficult.
Yeah, shout out Jet KVM for also just having the nicest looking hardware. That's the upper
Yeah,
left one. It's got this
yeah,
crispy
Hmm.
little screen on there. It's like these chamfered edges or whatever. It has a more polished vibe versus these other ones are just like, that looks like a USB brick I found on the ground and I'm not
right, right.
plugging in. Like, it's funny that you can tell just just by looking a little bit, you can get a sense of the quality of the build. But all right, let's get into the specific ones. So there were four, right? In the GLINet, Comet RM1 is the model, right? A couple different types.
Hmm.
Ray, you were the primary researcher behind each of these. I don't know, what was your experience like, slash I don't know, what sort of risks are represented by these types of vulnerabilities? There's firmware stuff, there's UART stuff, like there's some deep deep sort of infrastructural issues with this device. I don't know what
Yeah.
people need to know about this.
Well, first, I think to start out with the firmware one, insufficient firmware verification. That one was really interesting. Their decision not to fix it was interesting. It's inherently basically you in the firmware file in the firmware update files. There's a MD5 hash at the end. It is calculated um, for that portion, that part of the firmware, and then the KVM then checks it and then verifies the integrity. There is no firmware like signature verification, nothing like that. So any attacker, anyone can make their own firmware files that look legitimate. The KVM will just happily update. Um, that was really concerning, in the world of like firmware, like malicious firmware updates, or like when in scenarios where like if a CDN gets compromised, right? It could be definitely be a large supply chain attack, definitely.
Mm.
General total lack of respect for firmware as part of the supply chain security throughout the realm. I think it's getting better now, but overall, people just are a lot less concerned about firmware than they should be. And I think a small
Yeah,
handful of that type of situation that you're describing, where a CDN gets compromised and delivers a bunch of uh, malicious firmware that makes it through because of this lack of validation or verification. And folks are going to start wanting to investigate the integrity and monitor the integrity of their firmware a little more, which
right,
will be a bad thing overall, but good for business for Eclipsium because that's what we help people do.
right. The UART one was interesting. It was one of the first vulnerabilities I had found with the GL in it. I tore it down first. We saw the UART pin headers on the board. They were already soldered on, so no soldering was required.
Nice.
Labeled too, which is nice.
Even better.
Uh, so yeah, I hooked up to it and it just dropped me into a root shell, which was really surprising. Like in usually what happens is that they either have a password, which is usually admin or whatever, right? But if they're actually being secure, it's going to be like something else. Like it'll be the it'll be randomized or something. It'll be on like the back of your it'll be on the label or something. Like it'll be tied to it usually is tied to like admin account on Linux. Usually these are Linux, right? So it usually drops you into a shell on either like root or admin, and that is usually tied to a default password where you can usually find it online.
Or
Um,
you can find it in the firmware itself. A good indicator that this particular vulnerability exists on a device is if you take the device's firmware and you unpack it and you look on the
mhm,
file system and you look in the Etsy shadow file, if there's a root user in there with no password, it typically means that your UART access will just drop you into a root
right.
root shell. Not all the time, but that's a good indicator.
Yeah, but in this case, it was definitely just dropping it to a root shell. It's interesting that they didn't fix it. I think it's definitely like in the world of like where you don't know who's going to have access to these, right?
Yeah.
You know,
Well, it's interesting. So the GLINet is trying to plan a fix for these, I should say. And it was an interesting point in the disclosure. It actually led to the development of like Paul's personal disclosure policy is that if we disclose a vulnerability or anyone discloses a vulnerability, and the vendor that is responsible for that says, "Oh, well, we're planning a fix." I don't consider a plan if you just tell me, "Hey, we're planning a fix." A planned fix to me means I need the information as to a time frame and target version. Then to me that is the word plan. If you just say, "Oh yeah, we're going to fix that," that's a promise, not a plan. Um, and so I think even USART kind of backed me up on that. I was like, I'm more than happy to say that you're planning a fix. However, you got to just tell me like when can we expect that fix and roughly what version is that fix going to be in. And they may have since done that. I haven't actually checked back in to see if they did that. But they did want to fix them. They just couldn't commit to any kind of time frame. So to me, that's not planned.
Right.
Yeah,
If you don't
totally.
have a plan, it's not a planned fix.
Right.
We have a good question here in the chat that I think let's answer it before we get too far away from the firmware one. But are any of these using open source packages for their firmware or all proprietary, prompted by that first vuln in the firmware verification?
Yeah, this was most of these KVMs use Linux, which was interesting, right? Um, we had requested a lot of OpenGPL, GPL code, stuff like that. But some of that stuff never went anywhere because companies do that. But I think a notable one was SizeFeed. All their KVM images are just on GitHub. You can look through it, download it, right? And that was really interesting. JLET was not, right? These are they weren't open source, but theoretically they should have been, right? Like some of these should have been um, complying to GPL, right? Like,
Hmm.
but a lot of that like just doesn't happen, right? They just like SciSpeed um, had committed to it, which is really nice for us. But yeah,
Yeah, I think it's a conscious decision from the manufacturer too. So Cyped and Jet KVM um, completely open sourced their firmware. Um,
mhm,
and I'm not sure what went behind that decision. I think it's super cool that they did that. Jet KVM, and we'll talk about it a little bit. Not only is their like firmware and web interface open source, but their complete backend is open source as well.
yeah,
So they have like a cloud service, and that is also open source. I think it shows their commitment to security that they're not hiding anything, and we'll talk about how we used that to our advantage in the research to discover vulnerabilities.
yeah. The backend being open source is really interesting. I
Hmm.
haven't really heard of that before.
I was
I
kind of
think,
shy. It allowed for some
yeah,
pretty cool stuff. Yeah.
yeah, that was definitely interesting. Hopefully like more companies see this and like see that and kind of hopefully, in a better world, but it'd be nice if everyone, just more committed something to more like something more open source, I think it's definitely better for the security community. As you said, like we can just audit stuff just more easily, automate it, right?
Yep. 100%.
Nice. All right, so you got two other vulnerabilities on here. I don't know, maybe just a quick summary of those, and then yeah, we
Yeah.
want to make sure to cover the other couple vendors as well.
Yeah, the insufficient brute force protection was definitely interesting too. We had come across this like kind of pattern in KVMs where there would be no rate limiting. Just I think in your JKVM, right? There was no
Yeah,
rate limiting as well.
and it was just a password. There was no username.
Yeah, so also common in these KVMs is that like, there's no user, or if there is, it's implemented in a way where there can be no other users.
Right.
Uh, it's just like a static admin user that it's always going to be admin, right, by
Mhm.
default. But these are in the GLinet, there was no rate limiting, nothing like that. I had tested it, and yeah, it was I think it was about 2,000 a minute. something like that. Passwords a minute you could do, you could just throw at it. And that was really, worrying. Like I think I do think the bare minimum should be like rate limiting. Like
Yeah.
you should at least do that, right? Because like that's kind of like, you know, it's kind of the login page is kind of like your last defense, against anyone. Like if anyone's gonna try, if you leave your KVM open on the internet, or someone gets into your VLAN, right?
Hmm.
The only thing stopping them is that login page, right?
Right. Yeah. So they're motivated because it's physical access equivalent if
Right.
they do it. So
Um, the insecure initial provisioning cloud was definitely interesting. Um, that was interesting because the it does a really weird like retrieval for its certificates, and it only does it once upon boot up, but you could uh, pretty much just you know uh, kind of just break the chain of trust and like you know uh, you could how do I explain this? You could uh, you could block the request with a man in the middle, and uh, then I'm trying to explain this better, but give me a second.
I think you said you can put like fraudulent certificates, so you can
Yeah,
control if you're. I know we try and call it adversary in the middle now, but if you're in the middle of that connection, right, serve those fraudulent certificates rather than the real ones. Now you've got control
right.
over the trust chain.
And that was really worrying. Like, definitely a big issue. I'm glad they fixed it, right? I'm glad they didn't just look at it and be like, no, we're not gonna fix that. Um, but yeah, definitely interesting. The four vulnerabilities. GLI net was definitely like a big interesting one.
Mm.
And I think they have a other one that we were gonna look at, but we never got around to it.
So
Yeah,
I guess
they
we'll
have a
have
new
another
model. Yeah.
sequel webinar when we get on the new version of the GLINet. Okay, Anji ISO, the notable one that didn't fix it yet, and it was also the highest was like a 9.8
Yeah.
CVSS 3.1 score. So that's pretty big. big. Boy, howdy, this slide that I made about this is an eye chart. But give us a little flavor about what you found in the Anji ISO, Anji/ISO. Those are just two of the different brand names for the same product, right? Or it's like
Yeah.
the make and
Right.
thing. Okay, yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, unauthenticated file upload was definitely a big one. That was so the KVM had a binary that it ran on boot up that was called data bridge, and that was simply it listened um, on the 127, what 00.1, whatever, like, and that it was just listening on the network for a on the endpoint for a request to you could just upload files to it, and it would just take it in and replace. You know, you could upload to a path and then um, replace that file. So you could upload to Etsy Shadow, and it would just replace it. So you could replace your own. Um, you could replace the Etsy Shadow file and then get literal, just replace whatever, right? That was definitely worrying. It was definitely shocking because look, we had bought this thing from Amazon, right? Like you expect this, you kind of expect a lack of quality in like Alibaba stuff, right? AliExpress, whatever, But this was definitely interesting to see in like on Amazon, you know. Um, Definitely worrying. Um, the OS command injection one was definitely interesting too. So the you could use the file upload uh, to overwrite the config Lua script that it ran for its backend, and that was basically I had added that vulnerability to complete kind of like a chain, right? To go from unauthenticated to authenticated as root, and it was definitely interesting because it was just taking the config parameter and just executing it as, root. It was definitely worrying. But yeah, there is really not a lot of QA when it comes to these Amazon KVMs, and like I think that's a point we have to emphasize with these. It's like you really gotta like check what you're getting. I remember looking at the Amazon reviews for that KVM specifically, and it was like, "Oh, this thing's busted," you know,
Yeah, it
thing
didn't get
doesn't
great
work.
reviews.
Yeah, it's really funny. But yeah.
Yeah, the chaining, we talk a lot about vulnerability chaining, especially the sort of influence that it has, the difficulty of risk scoring an attack chain
Hmm.
versus scoring an individual vulnerability. Because when you have, I mean, something that's been coming up repeatedly recently is that medium risk vulnerabilities are exploited as often or more often than critical risk ones. And part of
Hmm.
the reason why is that folks just don't patch medium risk vulnerabilities as urgently. It's like it seems like you would need to prioritize it. But if you can chain a medium risk vulnerability, even an older one that just didn't get patched, with a new vulnerability to achieve a successful attack path, pre-authentication remote code execution path. That's not exactly what happened in this situation, but I do think it highlights the challenges in risk scoring, um, especially with just the rising flood of CVEs that are coming out, um, and the chainability of them to be more than the sum of their parts in terms of the risk that they represent to an organization that gets targeted with them. So, yeah, really interesting one. Nano KVM up next, SciP Nano KVM. That's again, that's the make and model. These things just have the like craziest letter salad of, of names on these products. Ray, was this you or Paul? Which one of you guys was the
Yeah, it
main
was me.
point
Ray.
for this analysis? All right. Ray, you're up again. We're making you talk a lot.
Yeah.
We'll give you a break after this one, make Paul talk about his ones.
Yeah, this one was definitely interesting. Uh, the so it was kind of multiple issues in one CV. It was really weird. The endpoint for setting the Wi-Fi, because so the nano KVMs come in three models, I think, or two, I believe. There is the Wi-Fi, like the one based with that has a Wi-Fi chipset on it, which you could connect to the, whatever uh, access point or whatever. And there's also the Ethernet one, which has the Ethernet port, which you could just connect to the your switch or whatever. And uh, the endpoint for the Wi-Fi to set the Wi-Fi SSID and the password was just left open. You could, without authentication, you could just hit it. This was because there was actually a typo in um, the authentication scheme for the endpoints. It was something like I got to pull it up right here. It was like to set a endpoint to be behind authentication, behind like a cookie or whatever. It had to be written to be how do I say this? You had to in the code base. It had to be what's it called? It had a schema that it then that it followed that which there was like a schema. I'm trying to explain this better, but there was a schema that all the endpoints followed, and then the schema there was a rule that which all these endpoints followed, and this endpoint did not have the actual proper like rule, which was validate. That was missing that. It instead had valid, which was a typo, and then which failed, and which resulted in the it just being open, you know.
Yeah, so that API endpoint didn't have authentication applied to it. It was left
Yeah,
exposed, right? Which is common in a lot of API systems. And this
yeah,
particular endpoint basically lets an attacker reconfigure the Wi-Fi.
yeah. It was definitely interesting because it had been in the code base for like a good while.
Yeah, no one found it.
Like, yeah, no one found it. Um, and and the memory exhaustion was interesting as well. You could send, there was no length checking when it came to the length of the SSID. So
Right.
you could just throw like huge payloads and it would just consume the memory. These things are not that big. They're like
Yeah.
really small. So there's not a lot of like like you can't really stuff like 4 GB of memory in these. I think it had like 500 kilobytes, something like that. Really small.
Yeah.
Um, so you could easily just crash it that way. But an interesting implication of this was like the network hijacking, right? Like you could, if you were near physically, right, you could point it towards your endpoint, your access
Your
point,
access point. Yeah.
and then get access to that to a machine, you know, that wasn't yours, right? Physical access. That was definitely interesting.
That's good
Yeah.
stuff.
All right. And now forward to our next and final KVM brand, which Paul, I think you're the researcher on. And then once we get through this, I just want to give a shout out to someone who asked a question that we will get to it. Someone asked, how would you compare KVMs to BMCs in terms of risk posture? Let's not answer that one right now because we have a whole section on KVMs that we will get, or on BMCs
Okay.
after we get through this. But I just want to let you know, question asker, that's a great question. We have a section on it. Would love to talk about BMCs, and we will get to it. Thank you for bringing it up. But for now, Paul, take us home with the Jet KVM vulnerabilities. What was the deal with this one?
Yeah, so really quick at a high level, and then I'll give a little bit of inside baseball. So basically, the Jet KVM did not cryptographically verify the firmware update, similar to one of the other platforms that we analyzed as well. So it means an attacker can put any firmware of their choosing, provided they can access it. Also has the insufficient rate, had the insufficient rate limiting problem where it could be brute forced. Um, the backstory behind the rate limiting was I actually used Claude to create a brute forcing script, but Jet KVM fixed it, so there was no need for me to release that said script, which you could code very accurately because we had access to the source code. So it understands the
Right.
Jet KVM source code, therefore creating a brute forcer for it was super accurate. Similar things with the insufficient update verification. There actually was a point in time where the update process was vulnerable. So the JKVM would, in having access to the source code for their backend was super helpful in fleshing some of these out. And so there was almost like a third vulnerability here, but JetKVM fixed it right as I was about to disclose it to them. And so it worked like this. JetKVMs have an automatic firmware update feature, which is great. It reaches out to an API and says, "Hey, are there any updates?" The API comes back and says, "No, there's not. No, there's not." And then it'll check, and the API will say, "Hey, I got an update for you, by the way, and it's this version, and you can get that update at this URL." So you reach out to api.jetkvm.com over SSL, and it would come back with that response. The software would then go, "Oh, I've got new firmware. Let me," I think it gave it the hash, the SHA-256 hash of it too, so it could validate it hadn't got corrupt in transit, right? But you could calculate that hash.
Hmm.
Then it would reach out to update.jetkvm.com, and for a period of time, it would go to http:// update.jetkvm.com. So if you were an adversary in the middle, you just through DNS, poisoning, you could intercept, or many other mechanisms, right? You could intercept the request to update.jetkvm.com, send it a valid response, which I think it was just like the version, which you could change, by the way, the SHA-256 sum that you, as the attacker, would calculate, and firmware of your choosing, which prior to them fixing it could be any firmware because it wasn't verified by the platform. But as I was getting ready to make that disclosure, they actually changed it so that update.jetkvm.com used SSL, or TLS. So then I proceeded to test all of the different ways to break SSL or TLS on the system, and it passed all of those with flying colors. I implore other researchers, if you want to look into it, by all means. I was not able to find anything there, and JetKVM fixed both of these vulnerabilities, which is great. So I also had it. I had Claude Code, actually a fake update server, because I had the code to the actual update server. Claude could very easily create our own copy that would serve any firmware that we wanted back to the Jet KVM and have the responses perfectly formatted, because we had access to all the code. So
Shout out Claude Code for threat research.
yes, yes.
It's
And this was
real.
this was last year. This was not Opus 4.6 Claude Code vulnerability research. This was a previous model.
I heard 4.6 actually got kind of nerfed, but 4.7 just came out. It's
I
impossible
heard,
to
I
keep
heard, yeah,
up. Oh man. All right. So something that you guys found out in the process of this research was that the number of these that are exposed to the internet, and this is a huge issue with all sorts of management plane kind of vulnerabilities, right? Is that the management interface gets exposed to the internet. You found a quote from Run Zero in June that there was about 400 or so of these exposed to the internet. And then you guys looked again in January of this year, so about 6 months later, and there were around 1,600 or more. Okay, so those are like relatively low total numbers, but that is a 400% or a 300% increase, which doesn't bode well. It's not a great trajectory. These kinds of things are so appealing, as you mentioned, for they're just so cheap and they do a thing you need them to do.
yeah.
And I
Right.
I
think,
think, more of them came on the market being low cost, providing the same functionality that the really expensive ones provide. And then you had all those YouTubers that were reviewing them. I mean, Ray and I actually went through a bunch of those YouTube videos and learned a bunch about the platform because so many people had reviewed them. Some of them even disclosed vulnerabilities previously to Ray and I disclosing vulnerabilities. But they became popular because of those reasons, right? The market
mhm.
saw more of them available, they're lower cost, and they got a huge marketing boost by all these people who were reviewing them. Some big channels, right, were reviewing them. So
Nice. All right, I'm going to wait on the discussion question. So this is just a little graphic we made about the vulnerabilities we just talked about, what's patched, what won't be, and the risk. And unfortunately, the ones that are the least have the least progress on patching are also the furthest along, or the highest on their CVSS scores. So again, shout out Jet KVM for fixing all those. That was a Kickstarter project, right? So they raised like
it
five.
was, yeah.
Really good work. Okay, we'll take a minute for a discussion, and then we're going to get into our BMC topic next. We already have a question about that one, so hold tight on the BMC topic. But I would be curious. I'm just going to throw this out there, and then I'm hoping some audience folks will put their questions and comments in the chat about what remote access tools or remote monitoring and management platforms do you use and how do you secure them? This can be anything from your home lab to at work, your data center, your enterprise IT environment that you are in charge of. Like how do you handle this issue? Everybody has some sort of remote management challenge they have to face, and that inherently introduces security issues, and I'm super curious. Um, we have a question here too. Has any researcher scanned the internet looking for device fingerprints for these devices to get an idea for the level of exposure out in the wild? Maybe you were typing that question while we answered it, but yeah, totally. This the little chart that we have here, it's probably from Shodan? I don't know. Did you guys look on Shodan for this, or
Yeah.
how did you
Yeah,
generate these numbers? Yeah.
that was I believe the source for both of them was Shodan, both with the Run Zero research and our research was Shodan. So um
Yeah, absolutely.
I believe we even published what our searches were uh on Shodan. So
Okay, awesome.
feel free to do your own research and plug that in there. If you're using Shodan and kind of keep tabs as how many are exposed to the internet. Um, I have a Jet KVM that I use for remote access. I do not expose it to the internet. I keep the firmware up to date. I set a unique password on it. I should install Tailscale on it so that it is protected with a VPN. So if I wanted true remote access from anywhere, I would use a VPN like Tailscale. And Tailscale doesn't come out of the box on Jet KVM, but you can install a Tailscale client on there. And I believe some of the other ones support Tailscale as well. So that would be my recommendation to give you kind of expanded access, right? If you want to be somewhere else outside of your network and connect back to your KVM, Jet KVM, Tailscale is the answer because it doesn't expose a port to the internet. And I primarily use it, well, it saves me from having another monitor, mouse, and keyboard, right? But also I use it a lot for demos and testing. Because I can change BIOS settings right through my web browser, and I can do a screen record movie of that for any kind of demo. And I can just take a screen movie of my browser and interact with the BIOS and the remote PC and capture that really nicely and easily.
Dude, that's good stuff. Yeah, Tailscale, really good tool for that. I was looking over my shoulder because I have one of their hats. I don't
Yeah,
normally wear a lot of vendor logos, but yeah, a lot of respect on Tailscale. Okay, I have two people who have asked about BMCs now, so let's just get right into it. If you thought KVM vulns were bad, check out BMCs. What is a baseboard management controller? I'm getting a sense that our audience knows what it is, but just in case not, it's this chip that enables lights out management on. It's on, motherboards and servers. There's tons of these. They're in AI hardware, AI clusters too.
yeah.
This is
I
in the data
realize
center.
I realize how dated the references, those of us who are older might get it. Like you liked servers so much that we put a server inside your server. And that's essentially what this is, right? They're basically ARM-based computers running on a SoC, system on a chip that run Linux that provide you with that out-of-band access. Very similar to an IP-based KVM, rather than being separate from the system. Most servers, as most of us know, come with a BMC already baked in inside the hardware. Many of them are based on OpenBMC, which is the open source project that supports many different chips, BMC chips, SoCs that are used in servers today. Many commercial offerings, IBM, HP, Lenovo, Dell, what have you. Well, are basically most of them, as far as I know, are moving towards an open BMC based uh, BMC software, the operating system, right? Because the open source community is maintaining the entire Linux distro that needs to run your BMC. AMI famously with Mega Rack also has that's their product, right? It enables an API called Redfish for you to manage those as well. Are they safer or more or less secure than the IP-based KVMs? I mean, that's kind of debatable, right? Let's just say BMCs have had their share of vulnerabilities as well. Researcher Vlad Babkin that works with us has many CVEs to his name with respects to BMCs. I think we did 3 rounds of disclosure for BMCs, and many of those were associated with Megarack. AMI has fixed all of those. AMI is amazing to work with and is very committed to security, and we've worked with them on several different disclosures. And so they are actively, at least through AMI, very actively engaged with the security of their BMCs in that software. So, yeah, I mean, there's BMC vulnerabilities just like there are KVM vulnerabilities that you have to pay attention to make sure you update it, make sure you secure them properly. Again, the same things that we talk about when we secure any of these management interfaces, KVMs or BMCs, put them on a separate network, use strongest authentication that you can that's available on those platforms, right? Set good passwords, monitor the logs for any suspicious logins or suspicious activity. Many of these will spit out to assist log that you can consume. And analyze, enable the secure protocols on them, right? Don't use protocols that don't have encryption. Always use the strongest encryption on the protocols that are available, or just some of the tips to locking down any of these devices.
Yeah. A fundamental difference, I mean, a difference right now is that the BMC, it comes, it's soldered out of the motherboard already. It goes into your data center. It's less like with a KVM, someone really had to like go order that online and connect it and hook it up for it to have dangerous levels of access to the data center. But basically, any sort of gear that you're going to rack in the data center, you're going to end up connecting a BMC, and the likelihood of just being, you know, N-5 on its firmware version or whatever by the time it gets into your data center from your, the initial vendor through the chain of vendors that any sort of data center gear goes through, the systems integrator and all that. The necessity of monitoring, like scanning the BMC and checking the versions of stuff that's in there and just making sure that it's a secure, firmware, as well as doing that ongoing monitoring. And then, yeah, the authentication authorization stuff on it feels a little bit more urgent with the BMCs because they just are so inherently deeply embedded and have deep control in what is essentially always critical IT infrastructure for the organizations that they're inside of. KVM, someone could, buy one and plug it in, and that's not probably not a best practice for managing a data center to buy one of these Kickstarter KVMs. But yeah,
Yeah, that's my concern, right? I could see enterprises going, hey, we can save some money. We don't want to buy the
mhm,
enterprise versions because they're really expensive. I think some of them are over like $1,000.
yeah.
But can you get one for, $100? Well, that solves our need. It does the same exact thing. So why don't we do that? The difference is a lot of the security has not been applied. So that's not to say the enterprise IP KVMs don't have vulnerabilities. Maybe it's just untapped, vulnerability landscape. Time will tell.
All right, we got another BMC question. Are there open source tools for scanning BMCs?
That's a great question. It's super hard to scan a BMC, because it's kind of, it's embedded inside of the server. However, Nuclei is great as a scanning tool, and Vlad and I actually wrote Nuclei templates to test for select vulnerabilities. So if I were looking for a scanning tool to scan your BMCs, I would start with some of those Nuclei templates.
Yeah, we should put that in the email. We're going to send out the slides. We'll send out the recording to this, and we can put a link in the email for our nuclei templates that Paul and Vlad released that are specifically for detecting vulnerabilities in AMI MegaRack. So yes, in fact, Eclipsium has released an open source tool. It's not a totally generalized universal tool for that, but it's a good place to start. And AMI MegaRack widely deployed, highly possible that that's what you have in the environment. I think we maybe have time for one more question, and then we gotta wrap it up. Are you slash have you looked at non-networked KVMs? For example, home PC to KVM to corporate laptop. Fun times.
Right now, we're just talking about that. And because what I remember from I want to say the vendor was called Black Magic, but not the people that make AV gear. I want to say they made like server gear. I might be getting that name wrong, but I remember that you would have a device that you would physically plug all your computers into. Black box, thank you, audience. It was black box. So the black box device had buttons on the front so you could switch between the computers, but it also had, those of you may remember, right, keyboard shortcuts. So I think I was like Control Alt 1. That keystroke would be intercepted by the KVM and switch to port 1. And so then you could do like plus or minus, like Control Alt plus and minus, and it would like cycle through them. So you didn't have to like take your hand off the keyboard and physically push the buttons. That means there's firmware on those devices that is receiving signals from the keyboard, and could be an interesting security research project, it'd also be a really interesting place to put a keystroke logger because you'd be logging keystrokes from like all the systems that are plugged into it because there's just one keyboard to intercept for all those servers. So yeah, it was black box. Thank you.
Yes, good shout from the audience. All right, this is our last slide, I guess. This is just to note that BMC vulnerability is not at all a hypothetical situation. As Paul said, we've discovered many of them, but notably last year, the first BMC vuln got added to CISA's known exploited vulnerabilities catalog. So um, where there's one, there will be more. BMCs are a valuable target because of how integrated they are and the level of access and power that they have over critical devices in the data center. So, yeah, worth looking into the security level of anything that you're using for remote management at that level. The ultimate lesson of today's whole session is that remote management tools are a target and you should secure them accordingly. And we're at time. Thanks so much to everybody for joining the call. Thank you to the audience for your questions and comments. Always way more fun when we get to interact a little bit. We will send out the slides and the recording. We'll get you a link to those nuclei templates for detecting AMI Megarack BMC vulnerabilities. And we'll, yeah, just say thank you so much to Paul and to Ray for the cool research and for talking to everybody through it. It's been great.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Great session. And again, those of you that had already sent in your emails about the CPE attendance certificate, I will get those out to you. And just a reminder, if anyone else wants one, you can respond back to your invite or back to the follow-up email that we'll get out to you in the next day or so. And thank you, Chase, Paul, and Ray. We look forward to seeing everybody on the next session.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.